January 1st, 1995. The clock had just struck 7:46 a.m. when the earth beneath Kobe, Japan split open with the fury of a wounded titan. In 17 seconds, the Great Hanshin-Iwaji earthquake reduced modern steel and concrete towers to twisted skeletons, burying over 6,000 souls beneath the rubble of what engineers had promised were earthquake-proof structures. Highway overpasses crumbled like children's toys. Glass towers that had pierced the sky for decades lay shattered across city blocks. Yet in the surrounding Hyogo prefecture, something impossible stood untouched. 13 ancient wooden pagodas, some over 1,000 years old, remained perfectly intact, their prayer bells still hanging silent and undisturbed from curved eaves. While modern science failed, ancient wisdom prevailed. This wasn't luck. This was the result of 7 architectural secrets that Japanese master builders had perfected over 15 centuries. Secrets so profound that today's engineers are only beginning to understand their genius. The story of Japan's earthquake-resistant architecture begins not with concrete and steel, but with a fundamental understanding that would take Western engineers another 1,000 years to grasp. You cannot fight an earthquake. You can only dance with it. The Japanese archipelago sits atop 4 major tectonic plates: the Pacific, Philippine, Eurasian, and North American plates, making it one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. For the people who chose to build their civilization here, survival meant innovation. Starting in the 7th century, when Buddhism brought the architectural challenge of multi-story pagodas from China and Korea, Japanese builders began experimenting with techniques that would revolutionize how humans construct tall structures in earthquake zones. What emerged was not a single innovation, but a comprehensive philosophy of building that treated earthquakes not as enemies to resist, but as forces to redirect, absorb, and dissipate. The first secret lies at the very heart of Japan's most iconic structures, the Shinbashira, or central pillar. Walk into any traditional 5-story pagoda and look up through the center, and you'll see a massive wooden column rising from near the ground all the way to the top of the structure. For centuries, Western architects who studied these buildings assumed this pillar bore the weight of the entire tower, like the spine of a human body. They were completely wrong. The Shinbashira does something far more sophisticated. In most pagodas, this central pillar is only attached at the very top level and remains completely independent on all the lower floors. Some designs have it resting on a beam above the ground floor, never touching the foundation at all, while others suspend it from the roof structure. When an earthquake strikes, something extraordinary happens. As the building begins to sway in one direction, the Shinbashira, acting as a giant pendulum, swings in the opposite direction. This counter-movement creates a damping effect, absorbing and redistributing the seismic energy that would otherwise concentrate at stress points and tear the structure apart. Engineers call this a tuned mass damper, and modern skyscrapers now employ mechanical versions of this 1,500-year-old technology. The Tokyo Skytree, Japan's tallest structure at 634 meters, uses a massive central column inspired directly by the Shinbashira principle, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions are still the best. But the genius of the Shinbashira only works because of what happens below it, which brings us to the second secret, Ishibadate, the ancient art of stone foundation construction. In modern earthquake-resistant buildings, the structure is bolted rigidly to a concrete foundation with massive anchor bolts designed to transfer every ounce of seismic force from the ground directly into the building's frame. The logic seems sound. If the building and ground move as one unit, nothing should break. The reality is catastrophic. When an earthquake transmits 100% of its energy directly into a rigid structure, something has to give, and usually it's the building. Japanese master carpenters discovered a counterintuitive solution over a millennium ago. Don't attach the building to the foundation at all. In the Ishibadate method, massive wooden columns that form the building's main structure simply rest on top of carefully shaped foundation stones, with no bolts, no mortar, no rigid connection whatsoever. These foundation stones, some weighing several tons, are barely sunk into the ground, creating what modern engineers would consider a structurally unstable base. When an earthquake hits, the building can shift, slide, and even lift slightly off these stones. This movement is not a flaw. It's the entire point. By allowing this controlled movement, the Ishibadate system absorbs and dissipates seismic energy before it can damage the structure above, reducing the force transmitted to the building from 100% down to approximately 70 to 80%. This flexible foundation doesn't just reduce force, it also addresses a phenomenon called resonance that modern engineers didn't fully understand until the 20th century. Every structure has a natural oscillation period, the frequency at which it naturally wants to vibrate. When an earthquake's oscillation period matches a building's natural period, the effect is catastrophic, like a singer hitting the exact note that shatters a wine glass. Rigid modern buildings tend to have short oscillation periods, making them vulnerable to the rapid, repetitive shocks characteristic of many earthquakes. The Ishibadate system, because it allows the building to move semi-independently of the ground, creates a longer natural oscillation period. This length means the structure is naturally resistant to short, rapid vibrations that destroy conventional buildings. In regions where earthquakes produce quick, repetitive shocks, Ishibadate construction demonstrates superior resilience compared to modern anchored structures. The 2004 earthquake simulation at Tsukuba tested a scale model of Horyuji Temple's 5-story pagoda, one of the world's oldest wooden buildings. Constructed in the 7th century, the model was subjected to shaking equivalent to a magnitude 6 earthquake, while a modern building would have suffered severe structural damage. The pagoda model's stone-based foundation allowed it to dance across the shaking table, absorbing energy through movement, while the structure above remained intact. The third secret reveals itself in the connections themselves, in a joinery technique so sophisticated that it makes modern welding look primitive. The mortise and tenon system perfected by Japanese master carpenters. If you examine a traditional pagoda closely, you'll notice something that seems impossible for a structure over 100 feet tall. There are almost no nails, no bolts, no metal fasteners holding the building together. Instead, every connection is made by carving the end of one timber into a precise shape and inserting it into a carefully cut slot in another piece of wood. A single 5-story pagoda contains approximately 1,000 of these large mortise joints, transforming the entire structure into something that moves more like a living organism than a rigid building. Western engineers who first studied these structures in the late 19th century were baffled. How could joints with no metal reinforcement possibly be stronger than bolted connections? They were asking the wrong question. These joints weren't designed to be stronger. They were designed to be smarter. When an earthquake strikes, metal bolts and welded connections act like shackles, forcing every component to move in lockstep until the stress becomes so great that something catastrophically fails, usually by tearing, snapping, or shearing completely apart. The mortise and tenon joints of a Japanese pagoda do something radically different. As seismic waves travel through the structure, the wooden surfaces within these joints begin to twist, slide, and rub against each other. This friction acts like thousands of tiny shock absorbers distributed throughout the building, converting the earthquake's kinetic energy into heat and dissipating it before it can concentrate at weak points. The genius is in the looseness. These joints are cut with tolerances that allow for millimeters of movement in every direction. During normal conditions, gravity and the weight of the structure above keep everything locked in place. During an earthquake, each joint becomes a miniature energy absorber, allowing the building to flex and deform without breaking. Engineers at Tokyo University conducted stress analysis on replica joints from Horyuji Temple and discovered that this joinery system could withstand lateral forces equivalent to a magnitude 7 earthquake, stronger than any seismic event that has struck Japan in recorded history. The wood itself contributes to this resilience. Unlike concrete, which becomes brittle and cracks under stress, or steel, which can permanently deform, wood has a property called viscoelasticity. When subjected to force, wood bends and warps, absorbing tremendous energy without breaking. More importantly, when the force is removed, wood returns almost completely to its original shape. This means a pagoda can be violently shaken, flex to angles that would destroy a modern building, and then settle back into perfect alignment once the earthquake passes. The fourth secret lies in the pagoda's most obvious feature, yet one that architects misunderstood for centuries: its layered structure. In English, we call these buildings 5-story pagodas, but the Japanese name Goju no To translates literally as a 5-layer tower, and that linguistic distinction reveals a profound architectural truth. These aren't 5 floors stacked with continuous walls and columns, like a Western building. Each level is essentially an independent box-like structure, complete with its own roof, sitting on top of the box below it. The pagoda is more accurately described as 5 buildings stacked on top of each other, each one connected to its neighbors only through those flexible mortise and tenon joints. The design borrows from jubako, traditional Japanese stacked food boxes that fit loosely together, allowing each box to shift slightly without disturbing the others. The physics of this layered design become apparent the moment an earthquake begins. Because each layer is structurally independent, they don't move as a single, rigid unit. Instead, when seismic waves hit the foundation, the bottom layer begins to sway in one direction. By the time that movement transfers upward through the flexible joints, the second layer is already beginning its own independent sway, often in the opposite direction. The third layer counters the second, the fourth counters the third, and the fifth counters the fourth. The result is a mesmerizing snake-like dance where the entire tower writhes and twists, with each layer moving out of phase with its neighbors. A master carpenter who witnessed a 5-story pavilion during a major earthquake in the Edo period left a detailed account. He described how the bottom layer swayed left, while the second swayed right. The third swayed left again, the fourth right, and the fifth left, creating a sinuous wave motion that looked like the tower was trying to tear itself apart. Yet after the shaking stopped, the structure stood perfectly intact, not even a roof tile out of place. This counterswaying creates a phenomenon engineers call destructive interference. Just as two sound waves of opposite phase can cancel each other out, the opposing movements of adjacent layers work to cancel out seismic forces traveling up the tower. The energy that reaches the top of the pagoda is a tiny fraction of what entered at the base. Modern seismologists have tested this principle using computer simulations and shake table experiments on scale models. The results confirmed what Japanese carpenters knew intuitively. A 5-layer pagoda, experiencing a magnitude 6 earthquake at its base, feels the equivalent of only a magnitude 4 or 5 at its peak. The effect is similar to a yajirobe, a traditional Japanese balancing toy with weighted arms that can be pushed dramatically to one side, but always rights itself, swaying back and forth in diminishing oscillations until it returns to perfect equilibrium. The pagoda's layers act like the yajirobe's counterweights, each one working against the others to stabilize the whole. But this layered flexibility only works because of precise calculations that ancient builders made without benefit of modern physics or mathematics. Each layer must be sized and weighted correctly relative to the others. Make one layer too heavy, and it will dominate the motion, destroying the counterbalancing effect. Make one too light, and it won't have enough mass to effectively dampen the layer below. Traditional pagodas follow strict proportional rules, with each successively higher layer being approximately 70 to 80% the width of the one below it. This ratio isn't arbitrary. It creates what modern engineers recognize as an optimally damped oscillating system, where each layer has enough mass to influence the one below while remaining light enough to respond to the forces transmitted from above. The master carpenters who developed these proportions didn't have calculus or computer models. They had centuries of observation, rigorous apprenticeship systems that passed knowledge from generation to generation, and an intimate understanding of how materials behave under stress. They built, observed failures, made adjustments, and gradually refined their techniques through countless iterations until they achieved something modern. Engineering, with all its mathematics, is only now beginning to fully appreciate. The fifth secret hovers above every traditional Japanese structure, visible to anyone who looks up, but understood by few: the massive, sweeping roofs with their dramatically extended eaves. When Western visitors first encountered Japanese architecture in the 19th century, they marveled at these roofs, noting that they seemed disproportionately large and heavy for the delicate wooden structures beneath them. Some early observers dismissed them as purely aesthetic choices, the architectural equivalent of wearing an oversized hat. They couldn't have been more mistaken. These roofs are precision-engineered counterweights, performing a critical role in the building's seismic survival strategy. A typical 5-story pagoda's roof structure accounts for nearly 40% of the building's total weight, and that distribution is completely intentional. The heaviest concentration of mass sits at the very top of the structure, precisely where physics would seem to suggest you don't want it. Common sense says that top-heavy buildings topple during earthquakes. Japanese master builders understood something that took Western engineers until the 20th century to grasp. It's not about avoiding top heaviness. It's about using that weight strategically. When an earthquake strikes and the building begins to sway, these massive roofs act as tuned masses that resist rapid acceleration. The heavier the roof, the more inertia it possesses, and the more it resists sudden changes in motion. As the structure below begins to whip back and forth, the roof's mass wants to stay where it is, creating a damping effect that prevents the oscillations from building into catastrophic resonance. The extended eaves play an additional critical role. These projections, which can extend 2 to 3 meters beyond the building's walls, act like the pole a tightrope walker carries for balance. When the building tilts in one direction, the eave on the opposite side provides a counterweight, helping to pull the structure back toward center. The longer the eave, the greater the mechanical advantage. But the genius doesn't stop at simple physics. The roofs are supported by an intricate system of wooden brackets called Tokyo, stacked in complex geometric patterns that cascade outward from the top of each column. These bracket complexes look decorative, almost frivolous in their complexity, but they're actually sophisticated energy dissipation devices. Each bracket sits loosely on the one below it, connected through those same flexible mortise joints that join the rest of the structure. During an earthquake, as the building flexes and sways, thousands of individual bracket pieces twist, slide, and grind against each other, converting seismic energy into friction and heat. A 5-story pagoda can contain over 5,000 individual bracket components, creating what amounts to a distributed shock absorption system that protects the main structural members from excessive stress. The weight distribution extends beyond just the roofs. Traditional pagodas become progressively lighter as they rise, with each successive story containing less structural wood than the one below. This creates a pyramidal mass distribution that naturally stabilizes the structure. The bottom stories, which must support everything above and transfer forces to the foundation, are built solid and heavy. The upper stories, which need flexibility more than strength, are deliberately made lighter and more responsive. When combined with the layered independence we discussed earlier, this weight gradient ensures that seismic forces diminish rather than amplify as they travel upward through the building. Modern engineers call this impedance matching, a principle borrowed from electrical engineering, where you design interfaces between systems to minimize energy reflection and maximize energy absorption. Japanese carpenters were practicing impedance, matching with wood and stone, centuries before the concept had a name. The sixth secret exists, not in how these buildings are constructed, but in what they're constructed from. The choice of wood as the primary structural material was not simply because Japan had abundant forests, though it did. Wood possesses a unique combination of properties that make it almost ideally suited for earthquake-resistant construction, properties that modern materials like steel and concrete cannot replicate. The first advantage is obvious: weight. Wood is significantly lighter than stone, brick, or steel, which means a wooden building has less mass to shake during an earthquake. When the ground moves, the force transmitted to a structure is proportional to its mass. A wooden building experiences perhaps one-third the seismic force of an equivalent stone building simply because it weighs less. But the real magic of wood lies in its material properties, specifically something called viscoelasticity. Most building materials behave elastically up to a point and then fail catastrophically. Steel bends elastically until it reaches its yield point, then permanently deforms. Concrete cracks, and once cracked, its strength is permanently compromised. Wood is different. Wood is a biological material, a composite of cellulose fibers bound together by lignin, and this structure gives it properties that no manufactured material can match. When you apply force to wood, it doesn't just bend, it compresses. The fibers slide past each other. The structure deforms at a microscopic level in ways that absorb tremendous amounts of energy. Experiments measuring the compressive strength of materials of equal weight found that wood is twice as strong as steel and 9.5 times as strong as concrete. More remarkably, wood's tensile strength, its resistance to being pulled apart, is 4 times greater than steel and 225 times greater than concrete. These aren't minor differences. They're fundamental advantages that explain why Japanese wooden buildings can be shaken to angles that would destroy steel frame or concrete structures, yet survive with minimal damage. The flexibility of wood provides another critical advantage. During a major earthquake, wooden structures can deform dramatically, with columns bending and beams twisting to angles that would snap steel or shatter concrete. But when the shaking stops, wood returns almost completely to its original shape, like a tree branch that bends in the wind and then springs back. This elastic memory means a wooden pagoda can be subjected to repeated earthquakes over centuries and maintain its structural integrity, each time flexing with the Earth's motion and then recovering. Stone and brick buildings accumulate damage with each seismic event, developing cracks that weaken the structure, even if it doesn't collapse immediately. Steel can suffer metal fatigue, developing microscopic fractures that eventually lead to failure. Wood, properly maintained and protected from rot, can last indefinitely. Horyuji Temple's main hall and 5-story pagoda, built in the 7th century, are the oldest wooden buildings in the world and remain structurally sound after more than 1,300 years and countless earthquakes. No concrete structure will ever achieve that longevity. No steel frame building will stand for a millennium, but wood, that ancient material humans have built with since before recorded history, possesses the resilience to outlast everything modern engineering has created. Japanese builders also understood that not all wood is equal. The primary timber used in traditional construction is hinoki, Japanese cypress. This species was chosen not by accident, but through centuries of observation and experience. Hinoki has several critical properties. It's relatively lightweight, yet strong. It resists rot and insect damage better than most woods, and crucially, it continues to gain strength for the first 200 to 300 years after being cut. A hinoki beam installed in a temple in the year 800 would actually be stronger in the year 1100 than it was when first carved. This property is almost unique among building materials. Everything else degrades from the moment of installation. Modern engineers testing 500-year-old hinoki beams from dismantled temples found them to be stronger than freshly cut timber of the same species. The wood had spent centuries slowly curing, the cellular structure becoming denser and more crystalline, transforming from building material into something approaching a natural composite material. When you build with hinoki, you're not just constructing for today, you're creating a structure that will become stronger as it ages, that will be more earthquake resistant in 500 years than it is at the moment of completion. The seventh secret is perhaps the most fragile and the most essential. It doesn't exist in the buildings themselves, but in the minds and hands of the master carpenters who built them. This is the secret of knowledge transmission, the centuries-old apprenticeship system that preserved and refined these earthquake-resistant techniques across 40 generations without written manuals, without engineering degrees, without computer models. In traditional Japanese carpentry, knowledge is not taught in the Western sense. It is absorbed, stolen, earned through years of observation and repetition. An apprentice, called a deshi, begins not by building, but by sweeping floors, sharpening tools, preparing materials. For months, perhaps years, he is not allowed to touch actual construction work. Instead, he watches. He observes how his master selects timber, how he reads the grain, how he tests joints with his hands. When the master believes the apprentice is ready, he might allow him to attempt a simple joint. No instruction is given. The apprentice must remember what he has seen, must replicate from memory and intuition. If he fails, the master does not explain the error. He simply shows the correct method once, and the apprentice must try again. This system seems inefficient by modern standards, deliberately opaque, almost cruel in its refusal to codify and explain. But it serves a profound purpose that classroom education cannot replicate. When knowledge is transmitted through direct, hands-on practice over years of apprenticeship, it becomes embodied. The carpenter doesn't just know intellectually how to cut a mortise joint. His hands know the correct angle. His eyes can read the wood's resistance. His body understands the rhythm of the saw. This embodied knowledge includes subtle judgment calls that cannot be written in textbooks. How the grain pattern in a particular beam affects its behavior during earthquakes. How to compensate for slight variations in wood density when selecting structural members. When to deviate from standard dimensions, because this specific building on this specific site requires adjustment. A master carpenter with 50 years of experience carries in his mind and muscle memory the lessons of thousands of joints cut, hundreds of projects completed, dozens of mistakes corrected. When he trains an apprentice for 5 to 10 years, he is not just teaching techniques, he is transferring an entire system of embodied knowledge that took centuries to develop. But this transmission system is dying. After World War II, Japan lost a significant portion of its skilled carpenters to the war effort. The government focused on rapid reconstruction and modernization, promoted standardized building codes that favored quick, mass-produced construction over traditional methods. The Building Standard Law, implemented to guarantee structural safety, classified traditional construction techniques as non-conforming, requiring special approval and individual testing for each project. What had been the standard became the exception. Master carpenters who possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge found themselves forced to use simplified techniques on projects that demanded their highest skills. Young people, seeing limited economic opportunity in a trade that required a decade of poorly paid apprenticeship to master, chose other careers. Today, in all of Japan, there are perhaps only a few dozen master carpenters who possess the complete traditional knowledge to build a classical pagoda or temple from foundation to roof without modern materials or techniques. Most are in their 60s or 70s. When they die, they will take with them knowledge that cannot be recovered from books, that exists nowhere except in the hands that learned it through decades of practice. Yet there is hope. The devastating earthquakes of recent decades have forced a reassessment of what modern actually means. The 1995 Kobe earthquake revealed that many modern concrete buildings failed catastrophically, while traditional wooden structures survived. Engineers and architects began studying ancient buildings not as curiosities, but as functional models, using computer analysis and shake table testing to understand principles that master carpenters had applied intuitively. What they discovered is that traditional Japanese earthquake-resistant design is not obsolete. It is sophisticated engineering that modern technology is only now beginning to fully comprehend. Today, cutting-edge seismic design incorporates principles derived directly from traditional architecture. Base isolation systems that allow buildings to slide during earthquakes are modern versions of Ishibadate. Tuned mass dampers installed at the top of skyscrapers function exactly like the Shinbashira of a pagoda. The Tokyo Skytree, completed in 2011 and standing as one of the world's tallest structures, uses a massive central core that deliberately swings independently of the outer structure during earthquakes. A direct application of the pagoda's central pillar principle, the building successfully weathered the magnitude 9.1 Tohoku earthquake just months after completion, swaying dramatically but suffering zero structural damage. Organizations dedicated to preserving traditional carpentry knowledge have emerged, recognizing that these techniques represent not historical artifacts, but practical solutions to problems modern architecture still struggles to solve. UNESCO has recognized traditional Japanese wooden architecture skills as intangible cultural heritage, acknowledging that this knowledge belongs not just to Japan, but to humanity. Apprenticeship programs are being revived, though adapting to modern realities. Some now accept apprentices over 30 years old, something unthinkable in the traditional system. Some provide modest wages from the beginning rather than requiring years of unpaid labor. Some even accept women, slowly breaking down gender barriers that kept carpentry exclusively male for centuries. These adaptations may dilute certain aspects of traditional training, but they keep the fundamental knowledge alive and ensure it passes to another generation. Hybrid construction methods are emerging that combine traditional wisdom with modern materials and techniques. Contemporary temple and shrine construction often uses traditional joinery and structural principles, but incorporates steel reinforcement at critical stress points, adds modern seismic isolation bearers under stone foundations, and integrates monitoring systems that track structural movement during earthquakes. These hybrid structures honor tradition while leveraging technology, creating buildings that embody centuries of empirical knowledge, refined by modern analytical understanding. The knowledge that master carpenters carry is being documented through detailed videos, 3D scans of traditional joints, and comprehensive written descriptions of techniques that were never before recorded. While this documentation cannot fully replace hands-on apprenticeship, it provides a backup, a knowledge repository that ensures critical information survives, even if the unbroken chain of master to apprentice transmission is interrupted. Young carpenters who want to learn traditional techniques but cannot afford 10 years of low-wage apprenticeship can now access instructional resources, practice independently, and then seek shorter-term mentorship to refine their skills. The path is different, perhaps less pure than the traditional route, but the essential knowledge flows forward. Some master carpenters, recognizing the urgency, have begun accepting foreign apprentices, spreading Japanese techniques beyond the archipelago. American, European, and Australian craftspeople now study traditional joinery, return to their home countries, and adapt these principles to local construction practices. What began as survival architecture for a seismically active island nation is becoming a global resource, offering solutions for earthquake-prone regions worldwide. The irony is profound. For decades, Japan rushed to modernize, to replace wooden temples with concrete apartments, to abandon ancient techniques in favor of international construction standards. But earthquakes are honest assessors. They don't care about modernity or tradition. They only test what works, and repeatedly across 70 years of major seismic events. The structures that work are the ones that embody principles developed over 1,000 years of observation, failure, refinement, and incremental improvement by craftspeople who never wrote a single equation but understood structural dynamics at a level that took modern engineers generations to grasp mathematically. The buildings that are leading the way in contemporary earthquake-resistant design are not rejecting traditional knowledge. They are returning to it, translating empirical wisdom into analytical understanding, and discovering that the master carpenters who built the pagodas that still stand after 13 centuries knew exactly what they were doing. The seventh secret, then, is not a structural technique. It is the recognition that knowledge worth preserving must be actively transmitted, that wisdom accumulated over centuries can be lost in a single generation if not carefully passed forward, and that the future of earthquake-resistant architecture may depend not on inventing something entirely new, but on deeply understanding something very old. The buildings themselves are teachers. Every surviving pagoda is a lesson in physics. Every ancient temple, a textbook in structural dynamics. The tragedy would be if we let those buildings stand silent, marveling at them as mysterious relics rather than studying them as sophisticated engineering solutions. The hope is that we are finally learning to listen, to measure, to analyze, and to apply. The knowledge is there. It has always been there. We just needed earthquakes destructive enough and losses painful enough to humble modern engineering's arrogance and force us to look backward for the wisdom to move forward. When the earth stops shaking and the dust settles, what remains standing tells us everything about what we truly understood. The 7 secrets we've explored are not separate tricks or isolated innovations. They are expressions of a single, unified philosophy that took Japanese builders over a millennium to perfect. The understanding that survival in an earthquake-prone world requires not resistance, but acceptance, not rigidity, but flexibility, not fighting nature, but moving with it. The Shinbashira swings opposite to the building's sway. The Ishibadate foundation allows controlled movement. The mortise and tenon joints twist and slide to absorb energy. The layered structure creates counter-oscillations. The massive roofs provide tuned damping. The wood itself flexes and recovers. and the knowledge transmission ensures each generation refines what the previous one learned. These aren't 7 separate secrets. They are 7 facets of one profound truth. Resilience comes not from strength alone, but from the wisdom to bend without breaking. Western engineering, for most of its history, approached earthquakes as enemies to defeat through brute force. Build the foundation deeper, make the walls thicker, add more steel reinforcement, create structures so massive and rigid that the earth cannot move them. This philosophy produced buildings that stood magnificently until the day they didn't, and when they failed catastrophically, completely, burying thousands in rubble that had promised safety. Japanese builders learned a different lesson from their frequent earthquakes. They learned that the earth is stronger than anything humans can build, that trying to stand immovable against seismic forces is not engineering, but hubris. Instead, they developed architecture that acknowledges its own vulnerability, that incorporates that vulnerability into the design, that uses flexibility as strength. A pagoda doesn't survive earthquakes by being stronger than the earthquake. It survives by dancing with the earthquake, by absorbing its energy, redirecting its force, and dissipating its power through thousands of small movements, rather than concentrating stress at a single breaking point. This philosophy extends beyond architecture into something deeper about how humans should approach challenges that cannot be defeated. We live in an age that worships control, that believes every problem has a technological solution, that assumes progress means making ourselves invulnerable to nature's forces. But some forces cannot be controlled. Earthquakes will strike, storms will rage, the earth will move. The question is not how to make these forces stop, but how to build lives and civilizations that can flex with them, absorb their impact, and remain standing when they pass. The pagodas teach us that resilience is not the same as invulnerability. The strongest structures are not those that never move, but those that move without breaking. The wisest builders are not those who try to defeat nature, but those who study nature deeply enough to understand how to work with it rather than against it. There is a Japanese concept called ma, often translated as negative space or interval, but meaning something deeper, the conscious awareness of emptiness, of what is not there. In Western architecture, empty space is waste, something to be filled. In Japanese design, emptiness is functional, essential. The gaps in mortise and tenon joints are not flaws, but features. The space between the shinbashira and the building's floors is not an oversight, but the entire point. The looseness of the structure, sitting on its stone foundation, is not instability, but sophisticated engineering. This embrace of Ami'a, of strategic emptiness, allows movement that saves the structure. The willingness to leave space for things to shift, to not bolt everything down, to not weld every connection, to not fill every gap. This is the wisdom that modern engineering is only beginning to appreciate. We are learning, slowly and painfully, through each catastrophic failure, that sometimes the strongest design is the one that deliberately builds in weakness, that creates spaces for movement, that allows controlled failure at small scales to prevent catastrophic failure at the structural level. The tragedy is how close we came to losing this knowledge entirely. In the rush to modernize after World War II, Japan nearly abandoned the very techniques that had kept its buildings standing for over 1,000 years. The master carpenters who carried this embodied knowledge found themselves marginalized, their methods dismissed as primitive, their buildings classified as safety hazards, requiring special permits. If the earthquakes of the 1990s and 2000s had not so dramatically demonstrated the failure of modern construction and the resilience of traditional design, we might have lost the last generation of masters without ever fully documenting what they knew. That knowledge would have died, not because it was wrong, but because we lacked the humility to recognize that ancient builders, working without computers or engineering degrees, had solved problems we were still struggling with. The pagodas would still stand, mute testaments to a lost wisdom, and we would spend centuries trying to reverse engineer their secrets from structural analysis alone, never quite capturing the subtle judgments and intuitive understandings that made them work. But something remarkable is happening now. The knowledge is being saved, not just documented, but actively transmitted to a new generation. Young carpenters are choosing to spend years learning traditional techniques, despite the economic sacrifice. Foreign students are traveling to Japan to apprentice with master builders, then carrying those principles back to earthquake zones around the world. UNESCO has recognized this knowledge as belonging to all humanity, worthy of preservation and transmission. Modern architects and engineers are studying ancient structures not as historical curiosities, but as functional models for cutting-edge seismic design. The Tokyo Sky Tree demonstrates that the principles of a 1,000-year-old pagoda can be scaled up to a 600-meter tower and still work. Research institutions are using shake tables and computer simulations to analyze why traditional joinery perform so well, quantifying what master carpenters knew intuitively. We are in a rare moment where ancient wisdom and modern technology are converging, where tradition and innovation are not opposing forces but complementary approaches to the same challenge. The future of earthquake-resistant architecture will not be purely traditional, returning to hand-cut joinery and wooden pagodas. That world is gone, and the demands of modern urban density require solutions that ancient builders never faced. But neither will the future be purely modern, assuming that concrete and steel and computer modeling alone can solve these challenges. The future will be hybrid, synthesizing centuries of empirical knowledge with decades of analytical understanding. It will be buildings that use modern materials, but incorporate traditional principles of flexibility and energy dissipation. It will be engineers who understand both the calculus of structural dynamics and the intuitive wisdom of how wood moves under stress. It will be architecture that honors the past, not through nostalgic imitation, but through deep comprehension of why those old methods worked and how their principles can be translated into contemporary design. The 7 secrets we've explored today are more than historical facts or engineering curiosities. They are a way of thinking about resilience, about survival, about how to build things that last, not by being immovable, but by being adaptable in a world facing challenges that cannot be controlled. Climate change, natural disasters, systemic shocks that test every structure we've built, literal and metaphorical. The wisdom encoded in Japanese earthquake-resistant architecture offers lessons that extend far beyond building design. It teaches us that the greatest strength is often flexibility, that the wisest preparation acknowledges vulnerability rather than denying it, That knowledge, accumulated over centuries through careful observation and transmitted through dedicated practice, has value that cannot be replicated by quick technological fixes. That sometimes the path forward requires looking backward, not to recreate the past, but to recover wisdom the present has forgotten. The pagodas still stand. Through fire and war, through centuries of earthquakes that destroyed everything around them, through modernization that nearly made them obsolete, they still stand. Not because they are stronger than the forces that strike them, but because they understood those forces better than we do. The question now is whether we have the wisdom to learn what they have to teach, the humility to recognize that progress sometimes means recovering lost knowledge rather than inventing something entirely new, and the commitment to ensure that what took 1,000 years to perfect is not lost in a single generation of forgetting. The buildings themselves are answers. We just needed to learn how to ask the right questions. But these 7 secrets, as profound as they are, represent only what Japanese builders learned about earthquakes. What about the other disasters that have shaped human architecture across millennia? What about the typhoons that strike the Pacific Islands each year? Winds so powerful they can strip the roof off a modern building in seconds. Yet traditional Filipino and Polynesian structures ride out the same storms with techniques Western architecture is only beginning to understand. In our next exploration, we'll uncover the ancient secrets of typhoon-resistant design, the architectural wisdom that allowed island civilizations to thrive in some of the most wind-battered regions on Earth, and how these forgotten techniques might save lives in our increasingly storm-prone future.